Hello, this is a brief overview of the exam paper. Really, I'm doing this before the mock, just to give people a bit of an idea about the difference between the questions, but it'll be useful for the main exam itself. Okay, first things first, you're going to have an hour and 20 minutes, not a very long time, and that's to answer two questions which are worth in total 60 marks. Make sure, this advice at the bottom really is important, make sure that you read each question carefully before you start to answer it. Every single word of every question, make sure that you haven't missed a key word, a key phrase, part of the question that can shift what you take from the sources and so on. Do keep an eye on your time. You've got 60 marks, that's divided into 20 marks for part A, not 26 as that looks like, and then 40 marks for part B. Now, after some analysis, that works out at between 25 and 30 minutes for the part A, and around 50 to 55 minutes for the part B. Within that time, though, within the 25 to 30 minutes and within the 50 to 55 minutes for the part B, you need to consider that you need time to read and you need time to plan, and that process is something that you can practice and you can get quicker at. Okay, let's just have a look at the kind of the questions that you might be faced with. So this is first of all, you will always answer question 1. It says here, choose either A1 or A2. It's a bit like in GCSE that there were parts of the paper that you simply would never answer. This is the same here. You will always answer A1 because it's on Henry VIII, unless you're feeling particularly inspired and want to answer questions on Elizabeth and James, despite the fact you've never been taught anything about them. I would suggest that you answer question 1. You must answer part A. So there's never a choice about part A. You've got to answer this question, which is worth the 20 marks, and then you have the choice between two part B questions. So it's worth 20 marks, and there's a couple of things that I want to point out about the differences between the part A and the part B. So the part A, look at the instructions. Study sources 1, 2 and 3. Part B, use sources 4, 5 and 6 and your own knowledge. So for part A, it does not require your own knowledge. Your own knowledge gets no credit here. So if you've got a lengthy introduction that goes into great depth, in this case on the amicable grant of 1525, all drawn from your own knowledge, it will get you nothing really. You need to get straight into using the sources straight away. The other key thing I want to point out to you is the phrasing here. How far do the sources suggest? Look at the part B. Do you agree with the view? So, part B is about viewpoints. Part A is about how far the sources, how far the evidence in the sources suggest X, Y and Z. So this is all about source analysis. This is all about using those sources, weighing up the evidence, examining those sources to find out your answer to the question. Okay, so explain your answer using the evidence of sources 1, 2 and 3. Okay, so first thing I would want to do is I'd look at that question. I'd be wanting to highlight some of the key words here, maybe looking at the fact that it says obviously how far do the sources suggest that there was considerable resistance. Now that's obviously an important word, considerable resistance. Not just resistance, how far does it suggest that there was resistance? You're looking at whether there was or there wasn't. Here, considerable. Was the resistance described considerable? Considerable resistance to the amicable grant of 1525. So one of the things you'll notice about the part A is they're often on things that you probably won't know masses and masses about. You'll know what the amicable grant is, you'll know about the situation in 1525, but you may not know whether or not there was considerable resistance, and that's usually quite deliberate. They want to focus on a small part of the specification and they want to test your ability to analyse the sources. Okay, so let's go and have a look at some of the sources involved. I'm not going to go through how one would answer this specific question, but I want us to be aware of what the examiner is looking for. First of all, please do not go through source by source. We don't want to see an essay where paragraph 1 is about source 1, paragraph 2 is about source 2, paragraph 3 is about source 3. It's really important that you use the sources in combination, not dealing with them one at a time. Secondly, for a part A, and it's amazing how people don't do this enough, as you're reading the sources and as you're annotating these sources, you must look so closely at this bit here. The examiners obviously spend a long time selecting the sources they're going to use, but they probably spend even longer thinking about the wording that they're going to use here. So, straight away here, from a letter written by the Archbishop of Canterbury, William Warham. Now, although I said you get credit for your own knowledge, but straight away I'd be thinking, right, what do I know about William Warham? I know that he didn't have particularly positive relations with Wolsey. He was one of Henry VII's old councillors, and actually was quite critical of Henry's foreign policy. It's written by Warham to Cardinal Wolsey. That could be significant. Look at the date, 5th of April. Look at this straight away. I'm thinking, right, what about the other dates? Well, that was the 11th of April. That was the 8th of May. Is this perspective going to be slightly different from the earlier ones? Okay. Warham acted as a commissioner in Kent for the amicable grant. A commissioner in Kent for the amicable grant. So he is responsible for raising the amicable grant. Now, is that going to affect the way that he writes about the resistance? Is he perhaps going to be playing it up because he's responsible for it? Is he, though, perhaps as a commissioner, is he probably in a pretty good position to be commenting on the amicable grant? And it then even says the amicable grant was an attempt by the Crown to raise money, just in case you didn't know that. So you use the caption to really, really help you, as well as, of course, what it says. It's the same for the other one. This is a letter written by the Duke of Suffolk to Wolsey. Again, the Duke of Suffolk was a critic of Wolsey. He didn't like Wolsey. He was the one who famously said about how this country has not been happy ever since we've had cardinals ruling us, or something along those lines. The Duke supported Henry over the amicable grant. Now that's important. They've given you that, so you know that the Duke was a supporter of the amicable grant. Might that affect the way he reports the violence? Might he be tempted to therefore downplay the level of the level of resistance? Possibly. Okay, and then you've got source 3. You've got Henry's advice to the commissioners. So this is coming from Henry. It's his advice to the commissioners. Think about why that's significant. Now, whenever you're analysing sources, you must never analyse the sources solely in terms of their content. If you just solely in terms of the caption, you've got to be thinking about what they are saying at the same time. So straight away I'm drawn to that first phrase. It will be hard to raise the money. This is coming from someone who is a commissioner, so I'd be linking those 2 points, to perhaps think about, why he's mentioning that. It's talking about people not pressing it further through fear of the people. The general suggestion here, dissatisfaction prevailing. The general suggestion here is, of course, about considerable resistance. On the one hand, we could look at it. You could look at it another way, but there's certainly evidence there. But the other thing that you need to be doing straight away is looking for where there is some cross-referencing, where different sources support one another. So I'd straight away then be looking to source 2 and seeing if there is either evidence that agrees with some of the statements that we've had, or perhaps evidence that disagrees. So it talks about there being dissatisfaction prevailing, and with people not pushing it further through fear of the people, whereas he is talking about people conforming to the king's request, although there are allegations to the contrary. He seems to be making light of the whole thing. Anyway, having said I wasn't going to go through it in detail, I find myself drawn to do so. But the key point is here that we are looking at the sources, not your own knowledge. We're looking at the sources, and we're thinking about the weight of evidence. Which is the more valuable source, or which argument from the sources is the strongest? In terms of structure, more often than not, the most effective form of structure would be a for and then against. Within that, and then obviously a conclusion. Within that, there needs to be a sense of weighing the evidence, and I would want my conclusion to be built towards. So I'd look at the points forward, look at the points against. Where is the weight of evidence? Which sources provide the strongest evidence based on the nature, the origin, the purpose, all of those kind of things, as to whether there was or was not considerable resistance? That should inform your conclusion. For the top level, your conclusion has to be derived from the weight of evidence. Okay, as I say, I'll do a separate one on the precise approach in terms of technique, but the key thing is here, evaluation of the sources. That has to be part of your answer. If you are not evaluating the sources, if you're just picking out quotes and saying, well, this agrees with the statement, this disagrees with it, without any sense of weighing the evidence, then you can't really get above a level 2. Okay. So part B, on the other hand, and remember, you should be leaving something like 50 to 55 minutes for this. Part B, you have a choice, and we'll deal with. We'll talk about both of them actually quickly. This one says, do you agree with the view? Do you agree with the view that in the years 1511 to 1525, English successes in foreign policy outweighed the failures? So this is whether you agree with a particular viewpoint. This is about interpretations, not about sources in the same way. This is about looking at historians' views and which interpretation you agree with. So this is very much a kind of a for and against. Do you agree with the view that successes outweighed failures? Success on the one hand, failure on the other. Where do you stand? You need to use sources 4, 5 and 6 and your own knowledge. Part B, which you're not in a position to answer yet, but it says, do you agree with the view that the dissolution of the greater monasteries was largely driven by financial motives? Now, this is a stated factor question. Was it largely driven by financial motives? You could argue that on the one hand, yes, it was financial motives. However, on the other hand, you could argue there were other factors. So it's slightly different from this, where you're looking at kind of a judgment about how successful something was. This is what we call a stated factor question. You've been given a factor. Is that the main reason, or were other factors more important? Okay, we're just going to deal with briefly the BI, for which the sources are over here. So first thing that you'll notice about part B is generally, not always, but generally, is you have far less here. Far less in the caption. Now the reason for that is that actually the examiner really isn't interested in the finer points of source analysis. This is a different assessment objective. What it's looking for is your ability to evaluate a viewpoint, evaluate an historian's view, not tell us whether there is this is a reliable source, or this can be trusted and so on. It's really not relevant here. So they tend to use interpretations rather than sources. What I mean by that is historians' views rather than contemporary material. There is a contemporary source here, source 5, but you look at the part A, all 3 of those in this case are contemporary sources. And the emphasis is much more on weighing the evidence. Here, it's about viewpoints. So, once again, you're going to need to read the sources really closely, go through, try and pick out those arguments that suggest that it was successful, and the specific wording of the question being, do you agree, let's have a look, do you agree with the view that in 1511 to 1525, English successes in foreign policy outweighed their failures? So you're going to be looking for examples of successes. You're also going to be looking for examples of failures as you read through the sources. But while you're doing so, you also need to be thinking about your own knowledge. Are there examples here that you can then take further? So are there examples that you read about, like the Treaty of London, for which you can provide some additional supporting detail? Are there examples of success, perhaps, that are not mentioned in here, that you can then bring in? So you need to be thinking not just of what the sources are saying, but of course your own knowledge. If there is none of your own knowledge, not only will you not get the marks in AO1, but in AO2 as well, you won't be able to pick up those marks. You have to know the period inside out, and you need to know your examples that you can use to either support or to oppose a particular viewpoint. A couple of top tips for Part B is, say, I'll do a kind of a brief kind of lesson on this in due course, but a couple of top tips are making sure that you try, as ever, to use the sources in combination, but also think about trying to use the sources early in the paragraph. Use the sources early in the paragraph. Because the AO2 part of the mark scheme is calling for your ability to evaluate a view, to weigh up a view. Do you agree with a view? Now, if you are simply using sources at the end of a paragraph, you're saying, I know this, I know that, oh, by the way, it's supported by source 4, or by the way, it's supported by MD Palmer. That's not evaluating the view in the source. But if you lead with MD Palmer and you say, well, Palmer states that, he did this, he did that, and so on, this can be supported by the fact that, or this can be taken further when one considers the events of 1523, etc., etc., etc. You're using the source, you're evaluating that viewpoint. The other way to evaluate a viewpoint is to think about how strongly Palmer or how strongly Armstrong make a point. You know, this Armstrong clearly outlines a particular case would be one way of doing it. And I have a sheet with lots of useful phrases for how to develop AO2 should you wish to have a copy. So my top tip is using the sources early in the paragraph. Maybe use for source 4. This can be supported by evidence from Armstrong. That's evaluating Palmer's view. You're weighing it up. You're showing you're using the sources in combination. Then use your own knowledge and make sure that those examples are precise. You'll look at the other side, of course, but let's say you disagree with the other side. You might outline a viewpoint from a source. You might say, well, Armstrong provides some criticism of Henry's foreign policy, suggesting that the failures outweigh the successes, coming back to the question, of course. But then you might challenge that viewpoint with your own knowledge, building towards your argument. So you can outline a viewpoint and then criticise it, then disagree with it, building towards a logical conclusion. That's always the aim. Okay, so to sum up, Part A, evaluation of the sources, evaluation of these contemporary sources. You've only got 20 marks here, so it's short, it's sharp, usually for, against, weighing up the evidence as you build towards your conclusion. Part B, usually a more complex structure is required. Use the sources early in the paragraph, use them in combination where possible, use them when you move on to the second paragraph in disagreement, and make plenty of use of your own knowledge to support the points. The one thing that is common to both of them, and is common to every single examination in history, in the subject of history, it is to make sure that you are answering those questions. The specific wording of the question is absolutely vital. Right, hopefully that's given you a little sense of some of the key points of this exam paper, just allowing you to be aware of the difference between the two. As I say, I intend to do a Part A video just looking at the technique for Part A and doing something similar for Part B, but I hope that's at least a start.